Welcome to this special event examining the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, sponsored by American University's School of International Service. My name is Philip Brenner. I'm an emeritus professor in SIS, where I taught for 41 years. First, some logistical matters. This presentation will last about 45 minutes, with an additional 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers. If you would like to ask a question, please submit it through the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. Closed captioning is available. Please click on the option at the bottom of your screens for access. We ask that no one record this session, but we will record the webinar and it will be available on the SIS YouTube channel. I want to give special thanks to Kate Arian for organizing this event so efficiently and thoughtfully. Now to our program. In 1962, the Soviet Union began to install the first batch of what was ultimately intended to be 66 ballistic missiles in Cuba. Each missile would have carried 1 megaton nuclear warhead with an explosive power more than 60 times the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs that the United States exploded in Japan. Unbeknownst to US officials at the time, as they considered bombing the missile sites and launching an invasion, the Soviets already had brought the warheads to the island, along with nuclear warheads for tactical missiles. Most historians now agree that this episode 60 years ago was the closest humankind has ever come to Armageddon, though the events in Ukraine seem to be heading us in this direction again. Indeed, some analysts look to the missile crisis for lessons that we might apply today in order to end the conflict in Ukraine without reaching the brink of a total disaster. But too often, these pundits continue to draw inappropriate lessons based on myths about what happened. Consider the myth that President Kennedy stood firm and was inflexible and refused to negotiate with Premier Khrushchev. In fact, Kennedy sought numerous ways to be flexible and find diplomatic solution, which ultimately included accepting Soviet demands. In order for us to draw the appropriate lessons, it's essential that we analyze the crisis from the perspectives of the 3 countries involved. That's our goal today, and we have an extraordinarily well-qualified panel to do so. Rafael Hernandez, who joins us from Cuba, is the editor of Temas magazine, an iconoclastic and penetrating journal about culture and politics. Indeed, it is the leading magazine in Cuba for this purpose. He is a prolific scholar and was a member of the Cuban delegation in 1989 to a conference in Moscow about the missile crisis. That conference brought together key decision makers from all 3 countries. He is the co-editor also of Debating US-Cuban Relations, How Should We Play Ball Now? I'm sorry, How Should We Play Ball? Peter Kornbluh is a senior analyst at the National Security Archive, where he heads the Cuban and Chilean documentation projects. Peter is responsible for securing the declassification of more documents about the missile crisis than any other scholar. Quite an achievement. And thanks to him, we know much more now than we did. He's also the co-author of Back Channel to Cuba, the hidden history of negotiations between Washington and Havana. Svetlana Soverinskaya is a senior analyst at the National Security Archive, where she directs the archive's Russia program and its cooperative threat reduction program, quite appropriately. Dr. Soverinskaya is the co-author of the last superpower summits, Reagan, Gorbachev, and Bush, conversations that ended the Cold War. And most importantly, for this purpose, the Soviet-Cuban Missile Crisis, Castro, Mikoyan, Kennedy, Khrushchev, and the missiles of November. I have 3 questions for each of our panelists, and we'll begin with Rafael Hernandez. Rafael, Cubans call the missile crisis the October crisis, while Americans call it the Cuban Missile Crisis. Why did Cubans give it the name the October Crisis? Let me ask you a second question. You can answer them in any order you'd like. What led Cuba to accept the offer of missiles from the Soviet Union? And third, what lessons did Cuban policymakers learn from the crisis, and were these the appropriate lessons? Rafael.
Thank you very much, Phil. I am delighted to be with you in this conversation about the crisis, the 1962 crisis. In the US, it is called the Cuban Missile Crisis, a term that is blaming Cuba. This is why Cuba is part of the title, and the USSR for the crisis. The United States, with that term, is not recognizing it as a consequence of its own policy towards Cuba. That was the origin of the crisis. The word nuclear is also avoided. They don't call it the Cuban nuclear missile crisis. It is also avoided, which is expressing the prevailing fear. I think that the fear was exactly the prevailing feeling on the US side. And that was created by the self-fulfilled prophecy of the nuclear Armageddon. Not other event had Americans felt so exposed to nuclear weapons that they perceive as imminent danger. In the USSR, it was called the Caribbean crisis, confined to a regional conflict, the Caribbean, which was not going to escalate supposedly to a global level as the Korean War, as the Suez crisis, or Vietnam. So the Pravda, the Soviet paper, was not informing the Soviets about the danger, the level of threat that was there. So ignorance prevailed on the Soviet Union side. So while Americans were marked forever by the prevailing fear, the Soviets continued their lives as if nothing had happened. Cubans, since 1960, had become accustomed to living with crisis. So this was another crisis. That is to say, between states of alert, bombing of sugarcane fields and cities, US Navy warships that could be seen from the Havana seawall, civil war with armed groups in all the provinces, infiltrations and landing of enemy forces like Bay of Pigs, militia mobilizations, maneuvers, and Navy war games in the Caribbean and the Guantanamo Naval Base. After the Bay of Pigs that happened 18 months before the crisis, the idea of a direct US invasion remained as a daily notion, not only for the Cuban government, but for the Cuban people. The 1962 October crisis, as it was called, only pushed that certainty to the limit. But not even its outcome closed the possibility of a conventional war, nor did it grant security to Cuba and the Cubans. As far as the question of the name of the crisis and the fact that the crisis became part of a Cuban political culture, living with the United States as a next door neighbor. The second question was about the acceptance of the missiles from the Soviet Union. Well, I'm going to answer like I explained this to my Cuban and American students when I teach this class. Now, I usually illustrate the Cuban decision on the installation of the missiles through a parable, like the Bible. This is the parable of the missiles. A little one guy shares the same block with a big one guy. Every time he can, the big one mouths him, shakes him, stuns him with one of those big motorcycles, a Harley Davidson, in front of our doors to scare him and make him lower his head. One day, the little one guy is convinced that he's going to be run over with a motorcycle, and he starts looking for someone to sell him a bat, a baseball bat. But those with bats don't want to sell it to him. Finally, the little guy finds a big one who lives 10 blocks away with bats of all sizes. This one, who doesn't get along with the little one's neighbor, offers him, instead of a bat, a machine gun. The little one reasons that he doesn't need a machine gun because his interest is not to shoot the neighbor, but only to appease him. He also figures out that if he says no to the big one, he who has offered to support him in his fight with the dangerous neighbor, he can continue to be more and more alone than he already is in that neighborhood where he is isolated. In the elementary logic of a quid pro quo, the little one decides to accept it. After all, a machine gun will also appease the neighborhood tough guy, even if he has an arsenal. So he agrees. This is the way my parable about the missile crisis goes. Some imagine the field of politics as a big store where you choose the shoes you like. Neither in the economy, nor in security, nor in public health, nor in meteorology, those free choice function as a real premise. Politics is not a field where free will and personalities prevail about everything. Taking into account the clear and present danger Cuba was experiencing from the United States, Cuba had no option but to accept the Soviet missiles, the machine gun, instead of that. So as for the third question about lessons, well, this is the lessons that I think are consistent with the Cuban policy in the following years after 1962. Number one, the agreement that ended the crisis is not a model to preserve peace and security between a small country and a great power. It's not a model of something like that. Because, yes, the United States didn't invade Cuba, but no, the United States was never committed to preserve peace. Quite the opposite. Conflict and threats have been part of US-Cuban policy for all these years. And that created a sort of siege fortress mentality on our side, which is very negative, which is very counterproductive. Number two, in the relations with the great powers, small countries must combine the defense of the principle of sovereignty with political realism and prudence. I think that the Cuban lesson, was that realism and prudence, like the one that prevailed on the Cuban side, to cooperate with the missile crisis agreement, with the Soviet-American agreement, is decisive. It is not necessary, it is not advisable, it is not a good idea to do anything that may use as a provocation on the other side. Small countries, this is a third lesson, need to ensure their independence and sovereignty, not depending on other superpower, but depending on their own defense and security system. So you need to have a strong defense and security system of your own. Number four, a policy of principles is key to avoiding crisis and to finding solutions to conflicts. The question of principles is not a question of dogma. It is more than that. When we talk about principles, we are not talking about ideology. We are not talking about a doctrine. We are rather talking about practices dictated by a specific historical and geopolitical situation to integrate a community of nations that refuse to align themselves with great powers, be they capitalists or socialists, and that at the same time they require alliances that compensate for the fatality of the positions they hold. Number five, In international conflicts, and that reminds me a lot about the present, in international conflict, the use of force causes a spiral that leads escalation to the search for solutions to problems by increasing force. More force and more force will be the solution. That is the anti-lesson. Avoiding climbing, avoiding increasing escalation is key to averting danger. And finally, the negotiation and agreement are not an end, but a means to achieve stability. A policy of principle is basic for that. These are my 6 lessons. Thank you.
Rafael, thank you very much. But those are your lessons. And several of them seem quite appropriate. Are they the same lessons that the Cuban government learned from the crisis?
I think that the Cuban lessons behavior after the crisis has been consistent with its principles. I think that coexistence with the United States has been part of this. So the balance between coexistence and seeking peace, normalization with the United States, and at the same time resisting the United States' will to change the Cuban system, which is finally the core of US policy towards Cuba since the Bay of Pigs to the present. The balance between the two is a very delicate balance. So I think that taking into account the circumstances in which Cuba has played that position of the small country who is the neighbor of a big power, a neighbor who lives next door, I think that the record of that is pretty much consistent with its principles that combine a strong idea, the fundamental defense of sovereignty and independence, because sovereignty and independence are the premises for everything else. You cannot have social justice, you cannot have social development, you cannot have equality, you cannot achieve a better social system without independence and sovereignty. So sovereignty and independence are the keystone for anything else. To combine the defense of those principles as basic political principles, not just ideological terms, and also the ability, the position, the realistic position, and the awareness about any US signal that make us understand that they want to negotiate. Negotiation has been part of Cuban practice. According to what has been written on the basis of the declassified documents, negotiations and dialogue has been part of US-Cuban relations. Secret diplomacy, back channel diplomacy has been there all the time. And perhaps today we still have it.
Rafael, thank you very much. I hope people appreciate that getting the Cuban perspective in this in the United States is not something we normally have. You've given us a terrific understanding of that. Let's turn to Peter Kornbluth. And forgive me if I use first names. Dr. Hernandez should be called Dr. Hernandez, but is an old friend, as Peter and Svetlana are. So forgive me for using first names. Peter, the crisis is famously known in the United States as 13 days. Is this the appropriate time frame? And
you can call me Rafa.
I'm sorry?
You can call me Rafa instead of Dr. Hernandez. Yes.
Okay.
I'm going to feel more comfortable.
Well, let me jump in and answer this first question about.
Well, let me lay out all three, and then you can answer them any way you'd like, Peter. How closely did the crisis actually come to being a nuclear war? And from the U.S. side, what did the U.S. policymakers lessons? What did they derive from the crisis, and with these the appropriate lessons? Peter.
So, the crisis is known as 13 Days, really because of the widely popular and widely read memoir of Robert Kennedy called 13 Days. And that book came out after he was assassinated in 1968. And it was widely read. It was short. It was based on his diaries. There was a TV movie made based on the book. There was a Hollywood movie starring Kevin Costner based on the book, also called 13 Days. And of course, the 13 Days refers to the period of time between the moment when President Kennedy was informed by the CIA that the missiles were in Cuba on the 16th of October until the 28th of October, when Nikita Khrushchev announced that he was withdrawing the missiles. It's a very narrow period of time. It certainly refers to the tensest moments and the most dangerous days that civilization has experienced, but it doesn't really capture all that is involved with the Cuban Missile Crisis. At the National Security Archive, where Svetlana and I work, we have done a series of postings, many of them Svetlana doing herself with Tom Blanton, postulating that the crisis was really 59 days, that it started on the day, October 4th, when the first nuclear warhead arrived in Cuba, October 4th, 1962, and ended on December 1st, I believe, when the last nuclear warhead was taken out of Cuba, withdrawn from Cuba. And that's one other time frame of looking at it. And then if you're a Cuban, I suspect you would date the Cuban Missile Crisis all the way back to April of 1961, when the United States and the CIA, led an invasion of Cuba in an attempt to roll back the Cuban Revolution and overthrow Fidel Castro. But I think historians will tell you that the crisis really abated on October 28th, but didn't end on October 28th. Into November, all the way through to November 20th, there was an ongoing conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union about withdrawing other offensive weapons with nuclear capabilities, and most notably a set of planes, the IL-28 planes that could carry nuclear bombs. And Khrushchev did not want to withdraw those planes. Kennedy actually wasn't that clear about withdrawing them either, but his aides kept pushing that that's an offensive weapon. Those planes can reach the United States. They have to be withdrawn. And then, of course, there's a whole Soviet-Cuban crisis over missiles that goes into November as well, where the Soviets, to mollify Fidel Castro about pulling out the intermediate range ballistic missiles, told him they would leave their tactical nuclear weapons for him, and then changed their mind and had to figure out a way to withdraw those missiles. And that was a very tense set of negotiations as well. That was at some point was not really clear how that was going to turn out. So the missile crisis continued well after October 28th, unbeknownst to most people. How close did we come to nuclear war? A number of us were at the 40th anniversary Cuban Missile Crisis Conference 20 years ago in Havana. Maybe all of us were. If Rafa, you were there too. And I remember that one of the Kennedy administration officials who came to that conference, I think perhaps Robert McNamara, actually said, we came this close to nuclear war. And it's true. I don't think you have to be in your 70s or 80s, I think, to fully remember how palpable the fear was in the United States and around the world that we were going to come close to nuclear war. But if you were in the Kennedy White House, some of his aides did not think they were going to live past Sunday, the 28th of October. And some of them were calling their wives to, essentially say this might be our last conversation. That's how tense the crisis was. Both leaders did not want to use nuclear weapons, but both leaders were being pressed by their testosterone, fueled military advisors to be strong and take a strong stand and use force. And there was a series of mistakes and uncontrollable events, particularly on what was known as Black Saturday, October 27th, when a U-2, US U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet anti-aircraft battery, and where there was a conflict on the high seas between US Navy destroyers and a Soviet Foxtrot submarine that was carrying a nuclear-tipped torpedo, with the captain not able to communicate with Moscow, thinking World War III had broken out, and giving the order to prepare to fire that torpedo. So as the history has unfolded, even Kennedy administration officials at the time began to realize that we really came this close to nuclear war through a series of human mistakes, uncontrollable events, and pressures on foreign policymakers to use force rather than reasonable diplomacy to get us out of this crisis. In the end, that diplomacy did prevail, and the crisis was ended peacefully. And that is a lesson, frankly, that nobody knew about. The actual diplomacy, negotiation, and compromise that ended the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a secret agreement between John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev to swap US missiles in Turkey for the withdrawal of the Soviet missiles in Cuba, was kept secret for almost 27 full years. And the opposite lesson was put out through a bunch of spin by the Kennedy White House that Kennedy had stood resolute, had cajones de hierro, balls of steel, if I can say that on a Zoom, and had forced Nikita Khrushchev to retreat and back down. And the iconic summary of the Cuban Missile Crisis became the words of Dean Rusk, supposedly at a meeting at the White House in the middle of the crisis, where it appeared that Soviet ships had somehow reached the quarantine line and turned back. A rather apocryphal story, if you will. But Dean Rusk supposedly said, "We are eyeball to eyeball," and the other fellow just blinked. And this became almost immediately, when it was published in December of 1962, the iconic statement and lesson of the missile crisis. We stared them down. There was a game of nuclear chicken. Kennedy won, Khrushchev blinked and retreated. This was the false lesson that became ingrained in foreign policy folklore, that became ingrained in our political culture, that even became ingrained in the leading models and paradigms of decision-making at the highest level of the US government for more than a generation, because the true history and the true lessons around diplomacy and compromise were kept secret. This, I would say, was the most ultimate and dangerous secret, not just of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but of all of the modern history of US foreign policy making. And it's incredibly important that the work of everybody that is on this Zoom and others have managed to get out since the late 1980s, the true history of how the missile crisis was resolved, so that the Biden administration today, as it games out what may happen and how to prevent it in the Ukraine, has the benefit of the true, real history of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Peter, what would you say the lesson then should have been from the missile crisis?
I mean, John Kennedy covered up this true history and the true lessons for a variety of reasons. I think he, in his mind, you were weak if you negotiated, if you compromised. Even if you managed to save the world by doing that. And so he actually lied to his predecessors. He told Harry Truman that he had rejected the Soviet proposal to swap the missiles from Turkey with the missiles in Cuba. He misrepresented his actions to Dwight Eisenhower, his immediate predecessor, as well. And he let the history go. He never lived long enough to actually tell the story of his decisions himself. Nikita Khrushchev, however, did, and has a series of extraordinary statements in memoirs and in interviews about how he came to reject the advice of his aides that that the Soviet Union would look weak in the eyes of China and India if they didn't fire their missiles and then didn't compromise. Or did compromise. The real lesson, of course, is that political dialogue, negotiation over war needs to be prioritized. And in a world of nuclear weapons, that's an absolute must. I think the ultimate lesson, which has been shared, by the way, with by a number of historians, most recently the late Martin Sherwin, and was shared by Robert McNamara himself at that conference that we all went to 20 years ago in Havana, is that we can't have nuclear weapons. We have to destroy all of our weapons because the humans that control them are prone to mistakes, are flawed beings. And in crises such as the one we're seeing right today, you have personalities, you have circumstances that may lead someone to actually fire a nuclear weapon. And the only way to prevent that is not to have that weapon in existence. And so we have to get back to the ultimate lesson. There is no place in this world, if we want to go forward as a civilization, for these types of arms in our midst.
Peter, thank you. Very eloquently stated. And last but not least, certainly not least, Svetlana Soverinskaya. Let me ask you three questions. Let's start with the Soviet rationale for placing missiles in Cuba. Why did the Soviets do this? And Peter referenced the negotiations that occurred between the Soviet Union and Cuba after October 28th. Can you give us some more details about what that was and how dangerous that continued the crisis to be until November 20th? I want to recall for the audience that the United States maintained its strategic armed forces at defense condition 2, the highest state of alert short of nuclear war, until November 20th. And finally, what lessons did the Soviet policymakers learn from the crisis? And do you think these were the appropriate lessons?
Svetlana? Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Kate. I am happy to speak to this audience. I hope we learn some lessons, some real lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis. So to your first question about the Soviet motivation, the Soviet motivation actually was logical and simple, not as simple as just one reason, but the Soviets just acquired this new ally in Latin America, in the new continent. The Soviets really were so impressed by the Cuban Revolution because the Cuban Revolution was a genuine revolution and was not brought there by the Soviet Union. In fact, in the beginning, they mistrusted Castro and his party because they were not the traditional communists. But the Soviets felt that they had to defend that new revolution because that new revolution, in a way, shored up Soviet legitimacy, the legitimacy of the socialist way of life, the regime. So in 1960 and in early 1961, the Soviets were actually trying to tell the Cubans that they shouldn't worry about the US invasion because the Soviets were behind Cuba, because Americans were not that crazy, that it was unreasonable for Cubans to prepare for an invasion. And then the Bay of Pigs happened. And the Soviets were in this very compromised position in a way, because they were the ones that were telling the Cubans, calm down, you should develop trade, you should have normal relations with the United States. And if something happens, we will protect you. And when the Bay of Pigs happened, the Soviets were unable to protect Cuba. So the Soviet intelligence and the Cuban intelligence was telling them that another invasion was just a matter of time. And in the beginning of 1962, Khrushchev became more worried and more concerned about the survival of the Cuban Revolution. And so he was looking for ways to really protect it. And so that is the main motivation. The second motivation was Khrushchev's irritation and his searching for a response to the installation of the Jupiter missiles in Turkey. Khrushchev believed that he could see them from the Black Sea coast. You can't, but maybe he had super good vision. And the third motivation, and here, this motivation we can see mainly among the military, but also in Khrushchev's mind. If you put the intermediate missiles in Cuba, they automatically become strategic missiles because they can reach the US territory. The total kind of nuclear power balance at the time in terms of deliverable nuclear power was about 17-1 in favor of the United States. And so this deployment also intended to redress this incredible power imbalance. And while Khrushchev was talking about the defense of Cuba, his military were saying, well, that's very good, we will defend Cuba, but also we will change the strategic balance. What I don't find in all the documents that I read, there are certainly concerns about the Berlin issue among Soviet policymakers, but these concerns are not directly tied to the decision to deploy weapons in Cuba. Your second question, I think, is the most interesting one. So the crisis ends for the United States. People think they can sleep peacefully, but in fact, as you pointed out, we still have DEFCON 2. So the political leadership understands that a lot of things are still going on. And even while Kennedy and the US political leadership understands that we're still negotiating the end of the crisis, the Soviets know much more. The Soviets know that they are facing their own crisis. And their own crisis is in Cuba. Because in addition to those intermediate range missiles, they also had 43,000 combat troops in Cuba. And they had 98 tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba. The Soviets knew that the Americans didn't know about it. And the Soviets really, at the moment, did not know what to do with them. So Khrushchev realizes that Castro is very offended by the fact that Khrushchev practically used his country as a parking lot. He put the missiles there, then he negotiated with Americans to pull the missiles out. He never, during the crisis, even talked with Castro. So Khrushchev sends his best man, the best, most skillful negotiator, Deputy Prime Minister Anastas Mikoyan, to Cuba. Mikoyan was known as the Cuban on the Politburo. So Cuban land, this Politburo Cuban lands in Cuba, and he has 3 tasks that are almost impossible to achieve. First of all, he has to negotiate with the withdrawal of weapons. Second, he has to persuade Fidel Castro to allow inspections of the withdrawal. And third, with all that, he has to do something to still keep Cuba as Soviet ally. And I think really it's Mikoyan is the man who saved the world, because he was able to truly understand, empathize with the Cuban position. He understood the pain that the Cubans experienced. He understood that his own government did not treat the Cubans, did not treat Fidel Castro as partner. And so he, Mikoyan, had to redress these problems. initial position when Mikoyan just goes to Cuba was that there would be a massive Soviet military base in Cuba. Mikoyan, in fact, tells Castro that this base will be the most powerful military base that the Soviet Union has anywhere. He emphasizes and will be more powerful than the base in East Germany. All the other weapons, except the ones covered in the direct understanding between Kennedy and Khrushchev, all the other weapons, meaning the tactical nuclear weapons, the Lunas, the FKR front cruise missiles with a range of 90 miles with nuclear warheads, the ill bombers with the bombs will stay in Cuba. And just as soon as he promises this to Castro, then Khrushchev, under the pressure from the United States, makes the decision that the ills, the bombers, will have to go. So Mikoyan has to go back to Castro and say, well, we have to make this new concession, but everything else will stay. And he tells Castro that the tactical nuclear weapons will stay and we will train the Cubans gradually over time and then transfer control of these weapons. But as Mikoyan talks with practically the entire Cuban leadership, he lives there for almost a month, he realizes that the Cubans at the time were so emotional and they really did not understand the kind of the meaning, the power of nuclear weapons. And he gradually comes to the conclusion that we should not leave these nuclear weapons in Cuba. We should not transfer control. He's also against keeping a big military base in Cuba. He says, well, we should train Cuban technicians and Cuban specialists, but we should withdraw our combat troops from Cuba. And he does it in such a way that he does not just tells the Cubans, this is what we will do. He explains things to them. And finally, by November 22nd, finally, Mikoyan makes this interesting decision. He asks Khrushchev if he could tell the Cubans that they have a secret law, unpublished law, that they could not transfer tactical nuclear weapons to anybody if the Soviets are not in control. That kind of a complete shift of the position. And yet he persuades Castro and Castro agrees. Mikoyan promises absolutely everything else, conventional weapons. He promises trade, economic assistance, financial assistance, fraternal assistance, everything he can, but he understands that tactical nuclear weapons have to go back to the Soviet Union. And the crisis is really only resolved completely on December 1st, when the weapons, the nuclear weapons, actually leave Cuba. Because up until that point, if the Americans discovered that tactical nuclear weapons were still there and that the Soviets were lying to them all this time, in fact, Castro, in one of his conversations with Mikoyan, says, well, you know, we can hide them in the caves. Americans don't know they're here and nobody will ever find out. And Mikoyan says, no, absolutely not. We cannot do that. And we have this law. So he pulls the weapons out and he does it in such a way that he still preserves Cuba as an ally, very, very unhappy ally, very disgruntled ally. But while negotiating with the Cubans, he comes to deeply respect them. And he understands what a really bad behavior on part of his own government was this treatment of the Cubans. So to the lessons. The lessons were, I think, tied to nuclear learning. Castro, less so, but also Castro, Kennedy, and Khrushchev, they all understood that civilization could come to the end. And while the Cuban revolutionaries were saying things like, well, we're ready to burn a nuclear fire for the cause of socialism, to defeat imperialism, Khrushchev took the opposite lesson. He said, no, communists want to live, not die beautifully. We need to negotiate. I think the main lesson is negotiation and compromise. And after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev was much more willing to negotiate with the United States. His rhetoric cooled down. He did not call them imperialists as often. And I think this fear, this possibility, the real possibility of a total war created willingness to negotiate, to compromise, and maybe also, and I'm not sure, but maybe Mikoyan's experience in Cuba showed the Soviets that tactical nuclear weapons were the most destabilizing and difficult to manage nuclear weapons. And they never again tried to transfer tactical weapons to their allies after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Svetlana. Again, this is something Americans need to hear. Professor Cohen put in the chat box the questions, the observation that we don't learn this and wanted to know why. But let me turn to another question first. That brings us up to today. Mark Golden asks, Russia, and this is a question for the three of you. Russia is now threatening to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. How could we negotiate using the lessons from the Cuban nuclear crisis to avoid a new effort, a new Armageddon? How could we facilitate negotiating an armistice in Ukraine based on the lessons you think are appropriate from the missile crisis? Who would like to start? Peter, you look like you want to start.
Well, it's a certainly difficult question. It's interesting that because President Biden just a few days ago announced that for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world is facing the prospect of nuclear Armageddon, that there's been a lot of coverage of the applicability of lessons from the missile crisis to what's going on today. And the New York Times has reported that, the White House and the Pentagon, the State Department are all doing what's called gaming out scenarios, including scenarios of some kind of negotiation. And Biden, when he said this, also said that they were looking for what he called an off-ramp for Putin. And what's important to remember is that John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev found an off-ramp for the Cuban Missile Crisis at a time when it really appeared it was spinning out of control. And even though this scenario today is very different, it involves a war that's already going on, bald aggression by Russia against the Ukraine, and a lot of saber rattling on the part of Vladimir Putin. It's a different scenario than what was going on in Cuba, where there was not a war was being threatened by a U.S. invasion of Cuba to take out the missiles and to overthrow the Castro government during the missile crisis, but it didn't happen, and the use of force was not used in the end. But force is being used now, so it is a very different scenario. But the full lessons of the missile crisis and this quest for an off-ramp that might, provide Putin with a way of gaining something that he wants or needs to withdraw is ongoing. And that's so important. I think that the Biden administration is using a lot of back channel diplomacy. I think they have kept up the communication lines open, just like Kennedy eventually did with Nikita Khrushchev during the missile crisis. And I think that's very important, and I hope it ends in a resolution sooner than later.
Svetlana, do you have some thoughts about this?
Yeah, it's a very different situation. Those were the leaders who could talk to each other, write letters. This is not that kind of situation. But I still think I completely agree with Peter about off-ramps, and I know conversations are ongoing on some strategic arms discussions. But I think offering Putin arms control negotiations on something that he actually values that is outside of Ukraine. For example, I would say INF, Intermediate Nuclear Forces, with an effort to include China and Russia. The United States pulled out of INF treaty. That was one of the treaties that was very valuable to Russia, but right now I think Russia would not agree to a bilateral negotiation. Engaging China and restarting negotiations on intermediate nuclear forces, I think would be one of possible offers that Putin might be interested in.
Rafael, it feels like Ukraine is in the position that Cuba was in 1962. Do you have some thoughts about how this might end with negotiations?
I don't think that Ukraine is Cuba. I think that Ukraine and Russia has a completely different history as opposed to Cuba and the United States. You have on the eastern part of Ukraine some people that say they are Russians and they are an actor in the conflict. Actually, they are a belligerent actor. They are part of the war. They have been fighting there since before the war started, since before the intervention took place. We have nothing like that in the case of Cuba. We have two separate national interests, two separate states. In the case of Cuba, in the case of the United States and the Soviet Union in 1962, we have three single actors. And the war was not going on. The war never started. It was a conflict of threats. Now we have more than that. We have not only Russia and the Russian allies within Ukraine, we have also the Ukrainian government that is a particularly different specimen compared to the others in terms of looking for peace and stability. We have Western European countries that were far away in the case of the missile crisis, the Caribbean crisis, but now we are directly involved and suffering the impact of the war and are part of the conflict because they are supplying militarily to the Ukrainian side. And the situation is a situation of escalation that is not stopping. Secret diplomacy played an important role to restrict within 13 days, within 30 days, within 59 days, to restrict the war and to bring back the situation to a peaceful or not so peaceful coexistence, but coexistence. In the case of the Ukrainian conflict, we have more than 9 months of war, of real war. And this is going on and on and on. So the question of the use of nuclear weapons is part of the picture right now. So now the situation to me is much more difficult to handle. If we remember that famous quote by McNamara during the Havana conferences, there's nothing like crisis management. Remember that. So this is a much more complicated crisis. The Russia and Ukraine and Europe, Western Europe, etc., is much more complicated, much more actors, and it is having a spill of effect over the world, the energy crisis, inflation, etc. Nevertheless, political avenues have not reached a point of conversation, of simple conversation. So more and more, the use of war has been justified, rationally justified by those who are participating directly or indirectly in the conflict. So this is much more uncertain than the conflict in 1962. Paradoxically, it is much more uncertain.
Thank you. That's a perspective we usually don't hear. So we have about 4 minutes left. Let me ask the three of you as a way of summing up. You pointed to several important lessons. Why haven't those lessons taken hold in the popular imagination, at least in the United States? But maybe Svetlana can also help us understand how it's thought about in the Soviet, in Russia today. Any thoughts, Svetlana?
In the Soviet Union, we did not know until 1989-90 what actually happened. We did not know about nuclear weapons in Cuba. We knew that the Soviets were trying to defend the revolution and supplied powerful weapons, and that the Americans were trying to invade. But then we got a commitment by President Kennedy to not invade Cuba. Therefore, the Soviet Union won another international victory. So every country did a spin on that. And that spin prevented learning real lessons. I think that looking at oneself a little more honestly would help. Right now, I think on both sides in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I would say not on the Cuban side, but on the Soviet side and the US side, there was this urgent need to show that we were victorious. We did the right thing and we were victorious. And in fact, we are always right and always victorious. I think that stepping away from this attitude and examining each of, actors' major policies more honestly would help. And I think secondly, empathy, trying to understand the other side, even if you really don't like what they do. I think this is important. And I think we all should be talking about off-ramps and de-escalation right now. I think there's a lot of infatuation in the press now to say, well, how are we going to respond to a use of nuclear weapon by Putin? Do we respond in a nuclear way or non-nuclear, or demolish the Black Sea fleet? This is sensationalist, and that certainly adds the number of clicks. But I think the discussion should be taken away from this, how do we respond to a nuclear strike? We should talk about how do we do everything to avoid a situation of nuclear strike.
Very, I'd like to end there, but if Peter and Rafael, you have a last 10 seconds.
Well, I just want to remind you, Philip, of the time of the missile crisis and when it ended, and how the Kennedy administration spun this idea that they had stood up to the Russians and Khrushchev had backed down. And they put out word that Adlai Stevenson, their UN ambassador, had been so soft and he'd been an appeaser, and he'd wanted to trade the bases in Turkey for the bases in Cuba. Which he had, and he had recommended that to the president on the very first day, and the president had secretly gone ahead and implemented that idea, and then cast aspersions on Stevenson for having suggested it during the crisis management. And Stevenson came out with a statement that was very applicable at the time. He said, in this era, it seems that those who want war are heroes, and those who advocate for peace and negotiation are bums. And our popular culture has rewarded that idea, even until today. And that is why the real history of the missile crisis doesn't really catch on, because it's not as dramatic as the heroism of picking up a big gun and a machine gun, as Rafael would put it in his anecdotes, and firing it at everybody, as opposed to sitting down at a negotiating table and negotiating.
Rafael, last word?
I think that the bad consequence of the outcome of the missile crisis was that the structure of conflict of the US-Cuba conflict was frozen for 60 years to the present. Still there. The basic structure of the conflict is still there. On the other side, it had a very positive consequence in terms of Cuban-USSR relations, as Svetlana pointed out so clearly. So it was tested Cuban independence, not only vis-a-vis the United States, but vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union learned to respect Cuban independence, sovereignty, and autonomy. And that created a completely different framework. And that facilitated to Cuba to become part of the not only the non-aligned movement, but also to be part of to be a Soviet ally, and at the same time to be a leader of the non-aligned movement. And that had a transcendence. That was a very powerful influence in Cuban foreign policy to the present.
Wow, what a terrific panel this has been. Thank you so much to the three of you. An extraordinarily rich hour. We hope you can join us for our next event, SIS Global to Local, Hunger, Leave No One Behind. It'll be held on Thursday, October 13th. SIS Professor Johanna Mendelsohn Foreman will moderate a panel discussion about the issues of hunger and food insecurity in DC and around the world. Here's a slide with more information about that event and how RSVP. Thank you very much for your attention today. And again, thanks to the panelists and to Kate Arian.